Welcome back to another episode of Consciously Clueless, the podcast that teaches you how to live a healthier lifestyle that makes you and the planet happier. The world is changing quickly. Sometimes it feels like you can't keep up. I hear you. You want to make the world a better place, you care, but you don't know where to start. You know taking care of yourself is important, but how? I get it. I have a history of diving into a new endeavor seeking perfection and quickly feeling like I failed. Whether it was going vegan or learning how to recycle more, I wish I had guidance to keep me on track and not overwhelmed. I can't lie, the world needs your help. But it doesn't need you to be perfect. This podcast is here to help. Here we go. All right. It's another solo episode. I haven't done one of these in a while. If you are listening right now and you've been listening to the podcast and you've maybe wondered why I don't do video, well, you are sort of in luck. So I am going to start recording video as well for solo episodes. Just like this episode, you can go to patreon.com/consciouslycarly and you'll be able to watch solo episodes and shorter episodes there. There's also bonus content for Consciously Cannabis, where I toke up with people I'm talking to, or if I can't talk to that guest and smoke with them after we record, I toke up and answer some of your questions. So there's a lot of fun stuff. That's one of the things I'm going to be talking about today, is what I'm kind of looking for from Patreon this year. But let's dive into it. I usually try and do kind of an end of the year episode, but I didn't this year, so I thought it would be a good time to just do some updates, share some things that I've shared about in the past, and share those updates, and also just reflect on what's kind of happened for me and for my business in the last year. Maybe it will invite you to do the same. So if you're watching, I have my little list of things that I want to make sure I mention. I really want to be intentional about these episodes. So, wow, 2023. If you have been listening to the podcast for a long time or not, I started in 2020. I Googled, how do you start a podcast? And here we are. One of the things that happened in 2023 was publishing the 200th episode of this podcast, which is honestly still just crazy to say out loud. There were so many cool things. I guess it'd be a good place to start there that happened just with this podcast alone. And I have to first say that is so much in part to you listening. The fact that there are people that are listening to this podcast, listening to these interviews, listening and learning and sharing keeps this going, keeps me going, and is honestly just one of the coolest things I've ever done. So let's talk about some of the podcast stuff. I would be remiss if I did not point out that I had Ed Begley Jr. on the podcast in 2023. It was one of the coolest things. I've had a lot of amazing people, of course, on this podcast. And yes, there's some stars in my eyes, right? Ed Begley Jr. is a big name. And that was very exciting for me, but it's not just that. Of course, it's some of that, but it's also just the amazing work that he's done in this world. It felt like such a cool thing to feel like my podcast and the space that I've created on Consciously Clueless was a place where someone like Ed Begley Jr. would want to share about the environment and about plant-based eating or whatever it is. So that was such a cool moment, and I'm getting better and better at finding that ability to be proud of myself and just be genuinely excited about these things without feeling like it's braggadocious or whatever. I think there's a lot of socialization as women and as people to be happy but not too happy and blah, blah, blah. But, screw that. With some humility, of course, I am so proud of that moment. It was so cool and so reaffirming that I love doing this and I love interviews and sharing that with you all. So Ed Begley Jr., that was dope. Not going to lie. He, at the end of the interview, if you haven't listened, I would recommend it, of course. I really wanted to make sure I wasn't like, oh my God, you're famous during the interview or anything like that, because he's just a person. But at the end, I just kind of blurted out, like, also, oh my gosh, I love the Page Master and you were in it and it's really important to me. And it was this really nice moment, and he was so sweet. So go listen to that. It's quite funny. You can hear me kind of trip over my words with him a little bit. Another thing on the podcast was I started the series, I alluded to it earlier, I started this series, Consciously Cannabis. And that had honestly been on my mind for a while. I was wondering how to incorporate conversations about cannabis into my business because it's a part of my life. I think it's a part of wellness. It's about a part of plants and the environment. And it just felt more and more like I was hiding that conversation. So legalizing marijuana in Minnesota definitely helped to be able to have that conversation in a different way. And so once a month on the podcast, there's an episode of Consciously Cannabis on Wednesdays, just like always. And it has been really freaking fun. I've talked to some really cool people about wellness and about legalization and about the environmental impacts of marijuana and all of this different stuff. I've talked to Steve DeAngelo, who is known as the father of the legal weed industry, and Firstman, who runs a Rastafari village in Jamaica. It is honestly been a really cool thing to tie in all of those interests and keep connecting with just the most amazing people in these spaces that are talking about things like cannabis and mindfulness and cannabis and the environment and cannabis and plant-based living, all the things I love. So that has been a really fun thing to add in to my business and to my content in a way that feels good for me, and just continuing to break that stigma around this plant and around this medicine feels really aligned with everything I believe in. So that has been, that's just been really fun. And, I get to be honest about this piece of my life too, and using cannabis and talking about that. And other people reach out to me about their use and questions, and that's been really cool too. So I just love getting to share things in a way that helps us all learn. I learn in these interviews as well. And it's been really good. And I'm appreciative that you all have been receptive to those episodes as well, because of course there was a little bit of hesitation. Like, not everybody who listens to this podcast is going to be on board, but it has been honestly nothing but really, really good results as far as I've heard, and I will take it. So some other things that happened for my business this past year is continuing to do my work with yoga and mindfulness as a teacher. I teach an adult yoga class and have continued to do that now for years. I just saw an Instagram memory of when I was going through my teacher training, and that was already in 2017, 2018. So feels like a long time ago, but I also have been able to continue doing my work locally in the schools, teaching yoga and mindfulness to kids from kindergarten all the way to 8th grade. And I've talked about it before, but honestly, that work has been more rewarding than I imagined. Getting to talk to young kids, especially in the place that I grew up, about mindfulness and about moving our bodies and loving our bodies and how to show up in this world and how to take what we learn on the mat off the mat, and all of these conversations, and about anxiety and depression and all these things that they are very well versed in, despite the fact that we wish they weren't. It's just been so freaking cool, and I love it. And I'm so thankful that there have been continued support of that, and that has been really fun. I don't talk about it, of course, on the podcast or on maybe my socials as much, but it's a big part of what I do. And that's where the mindfulness piece that I do talk about a lot on the podcast and do talk a lot about on social media comes in, is that it's because my work with mindfulness that I see it is so crucial in living this conscious life, whether it's because of what you eat, because of how you show up in the world, because of how you want to change the world, because of your mental health, because of your physical health, all the things, right? Mindfulness just feels like this underutilized key to living your best freaking life. So that's why I talk about it all the time. And it stems from that work as a yoga and mindfulness teacher and instructor. Another thing that has been, I guess, a continued conversation for myself is this idea of not holding back. I've talked on the podcast before about this understanding that I had of being too much to handle, how I've unraveled that in the last few years. And I released an episode, a solo episode in September, where I talked about this realization that I had had working with a business coach, that I had kind of started to unravel that in so many areas of my life, but I wasn't doing it with my business. So I wasn't necessarily saying, I'm not going to hold back in the content I produce or how I share about things or what I say, which some of you are laughing because you're like, girl, you talk about everything, and I get it. But there was still this fear because no matter how much I do to unravel the societal bullshit inside of me, some of it is still there. I think I've worked up against this idea of being nice, especially as a woman and on the internet. I've shared in my Instagram stories and other platforms sometimes about the comments that I receive. And, as much as mostly I try and make that roll down my back, I sometimes am like, what are we doing here, people? And I want to hold back or I maybe don't want to, but I was holding back because I didn't want to make more of that conflict. And despite the fact that I was already talking about that in September, something about that really clicked with me in December. I was looking at how I talk about things in my business. It was just still a little bit different than how I was talking about things in my life. So for example, I feel like I have had such an amazing last year of manifesting so many things in my life that I have imagined and that have come true. I started a band. I am the lead singer of a band named Moonshot, and we have been playing open mics and practicing every week, and it is such a freaking blast and so good for my soul, and I get to hang out with these amazing people, and that was always a dream of mine. I published a book of poetry. That's pretty cool. I have wanted to be an author for as long as I can remember, and I talked about it on this podcast for a while and finally was just like, fuck it, I'm going to do it. And so lately, I've just been telling people, yeah, I really think I'm in my fuck it era. And I say it kind of flippantly, but I'm being true, and that is what I've been feeling, and not in a like, fuck it, I don't care about anything, of course, but just in this like, no, why am I not chasing after the things I really want to do? What's holding me back? Are there real things holding me back, or is it me? In terms of playing music, there wasn't anything holding me back. Publishing a book, there wasn't anything holding me back. These are all things that were attainable and mostly weren't happening because of my own fear. And so I just was like, no, I'm going to do all these things that bring me joy, and I'm just going to keep doing that. That's what I know feels good. And I want to do that even more, like lean in even harder with Consciously Carly as a business. And what does that even look like? So that's this podcast, that's my coaching services, that's the content that I put out for free to help people live a more vegan, eco-friendly lifestyle. And specifically when talking about veganism and talking about the environment, well, first of all, I trigger a lot of men on the internet by just saying the word vegan, but there is still a lot of stereotypes around the word vegan and being too angry and wanting to appeal to people and blah, 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 blah. But the reality is, if people want to listen or work with me, it's because I'm being authentic, and it's because I'm sharing what I truly believe. And I just feel like I've gotten to this point where I can't do anything else. It just feels gross. And so if you do follow me on socials, you've maybe noticed I've like even kicked it into high gear a little bit more. And that doesn't mean bad or that I'm being mean or that I'm being outrageous. It just means that I'm being really authentically honest about like, yeah, this is really upsetting to me. This is really sad. Or yeah, guess what? There's a genocide happening and we have to be talking about it. And even if it makes us uncomfortable, and even if we're not sure, we have to educate ourselves and we have to show up and we have to learn and we have to try. And if that pushes some people away, those aren't my people. And that's okay. And man, is that life lesson important, right? Like, we can find our community, and that is beautiful. And I'm not saying like get yourself in an echo chamber, but we're not for everyone. That's okay. But the internet sometimes makes you feel like you're not for anyone instead of being, just for some people or hopefully a lot of people, it feels like you're not for anyone. And I know that's not true. And I'm also not basing my entire life and how I feel about my life online, but I'd be lying if it didn't come into consideration because of the work I do as a content creator now. So it's just this interesting thing to navigate, but I'm feeling so much more confident in being totally honest in all pieces of my life and like bringing that fuck it era energy into my business, because I think that's what makes people listen, and that's what makes you want to work with me or take a workshop with me or whatever it is this sense of that person is just being so real, and that's coming from a place you can relate to. And that is related to what I talked about again in the beginning, is Patreon. So I started Patreon when I started the podcast as a way to create community, and it has ebbed and flowed in a lot of different directions. I have thrown a lot on there to see what people are interested in, what people are looking for. I tried different things. There was a book club at one point. There was a weekly video of food or recipes at one point, all these different things. And sometimes I think I was trying too much at once to really see what people were interested in, like in the beginning. And then I got discouraged thinking that maybe there weren't people that were really wanting to engage there. And then it's been growing again. And I just have this deep desire to create that into the community space I imagined in the beginning. And I don't think I've quite done that yet, but I want to now, because what I imagined this being, and like I've talked about before, I started this podcast to be a place where you get to show up and learn about these things. And I'm going to be honest, and so are my guests, and all of the things we share might not be your favorite thing to hear if you're talking about animal rights and torture and the animal agriculture industry or the environment. It's not all doom and gloom on the podcast, don't worry. But, you know, there's still, I hope, an energy that you get to show up because you don't know, because you want to learn. And that is why I started this space. That's why I started coaching. That's why I started this whole thing of Consciously Clueless, is you get to show up and learn about all the things to live a more conscious life. Even if you're clueless, that's okay too, because at least you're showing up. And I want to create more of that community space, because one of the things that is hardest about going vegan or leading a more eco-friendly life when you're maybe feeling like you're doing it on your own is not feeling supported and not having community. And so if you are someone who already is vegan and interested in sustainability, or has recently had that aha moment where you're like, I need to make some shifts in my life. I need to think about mindfulness. I need to think about the food I'm putting in my body. I need to think about my impact on this planet. If those things are kind of clicking into place for you right now, I want this space on Patreon to be the community where you get to show up even further. You get more content, you get more information, you get more interaction with the people that I'm interviewing, and we get to like cook live with someone, Kathy Davis, who's been on the podcast before a couple months ago on Zoom for Patreon. We cooked a meal together, and then that gets to be there, and you get to go back and see that and cook again. And I'm going to do something like that with a cookbook author coming up. So I have these things planned where I want it to be this space where you get to show up and ask questions and find support in people who are interested in these things like you, and have some mindfulness practices, have some vegan recipes, have some fun, whatever it is. I love creating community. I really, really do. I love figuring out how to bring people together, and I want to be really intentional about growing this space. And so if that sounds like something that would feel really nurturing to you, totally check it out. Patreon.com/consciouslycarly. I'm going to be posting more about some of the things going on there, but I want that to be the space where we go for that next level. You're like, I'm on this podcast train. I'm listening every week. What now do I do to keep learning and to keep getting more? That's where this space is going to come in. And like I said, there's bonus content there. You're watching this video there if you're on Patreon. There is stuff there already, but also to help you learn to live that more vegan, eco-friendly, mindful life. Not just bonus content, but more content to help you make those goals a reality, because that's the life you deserve. And that is the life I deserve. And that is the life I have finally sunken into, where it's not perfect. Don't get me wrong. And don't walk away thinking that that's what I'm like. Everything's great, because things are pretty great. But in reality, truthfully, a lot of those things are great because of my commitment to living more consciously. I don't think it's a coincidence that the last few years have gotten better and better as I've gotten deeper into taking care of my mind, deeper into taking care of my body and how I nourish it, deeper into figuring out how I'm connected to the rest of this damn planet and what I can do to save it. My life has gotten only significantly better because of those choices. And if that's something I know you're here for at least a little bit because you're still listening to this episode, I am just so glad to be going on this journey with you. I hope we are in the fuck it era together, whatever that means for you, just being fully authentic as much as you can and showing up in a way that only feels really good for you. And if that is something that you're also trying to do this year or next year or all the time in your life, I'm really glad you're listening. And I hope we can connect more and you can be a part of the community, because I know that that is what's going to help all of us keep moving forward, is having each other, learning from each other. And that is what I'm here to do. And I'm glad that you're here too. If you're hearing this message, you've listened to the entire episode of Consciously Clueless, and for that, thank you so much. I hope you enjoyed this new episode, and if you did, please leave a review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or tag me and share in social media. Share this episode with others who may be interested in this topic. To get more resources, influence on topics covered, and bonus content, join the Consciously Clueless community over on Patreon at patreon.com/consciouslycarly. And don't forget, if you need help living more consciously, let's work together. Email me today. See you next Wednesday for a new episode.